Former Prime Minister John Howard has defended Scott Morrison against criticism over his handling of the bushfire crisis. He's had an exclusive interview with Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell just a few minutes ago, and Andrew joins me now. Well, first of all, I should say welcome aboard, of course, but you spoke to the former PM. He's revered for his political antennae, Andrew. He's also very loyal to the party, though, and he says no blunders made by Scott Morrison.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. He won't concede any mistakes, but he does kind of make the point that all Prime Ministers, including him, have bumps in the road. So that seemed something of a concession at least. Let's see what the former Prime Minister had to say.
Well, I think a lot of the criticism is completely misplaced. I think he's done all the right things. He dealt with the issue of his holiday, and since he's been back, he's hardly drawn breath. I think the announcement, which is a very big announcement, but this is a huge national event, the intensity and the spread of these fires is quite extraordinary. They're breaking out with devastating impact in different parts of the country. I think it will go on for a long time. It's pretty obvious that the impact of the drought on the huge fuel loads in various parts of the country has been the proximate cause of the spread of the fires. Other issues, of course, will be debated in the longer term. But I think he's found it necessary to open the chequebook, and that is what I think Australians expect at a time like this. I'm sure that the money will be spent wisely, and I'm sure that it will be widely appreciated.
I guess there's been a bit of talk about his confrontation with the woman down in Cobargo, and the fact that he sort of turned his back on her, that he could have had a bit more of a human touch there, and that he went to Hawaii on holiday and didn't announce it at the time. They look like the sort of mistakes you can make at the start of a prime ministership, but do you concede they were generally mistakes? But
oh, look, I'm not going to concede anything with great respect. I mean, I don't know the full context of the exchange with the lady, and you meet a lot of people as Prime Minister, and there are different reactions. But I think the last thing you could ever say about Scott Morrison is that he lacks compassion and empathy. I've always found him somebody who looks to people as individuals and cares about the human impact on individuals and their families. There's nothing robotic about him in my experience, so I'd defend him very strongly in that context.
Now, you spoke about the scale of the disaster. It does raise the question, I guess, is this something where in future, if we're going to see disasters like this, you need a federal body pretty much in charge, that the state governments can't do it on their own? Do you have a view on that?
Look, people often say that when something like this happens, but the reality is that all of the agencies that are immediately called upon are state agencies. And absent a complete rewrite of the federal compact, whereby everything is handed over to the federal government, the only effective way is for governments to cooperate. And I have to say that as an ordinary citizen now, and just following the news and watching the television, it seems to me as though the governments have cooperated. There's been a very strong, good working relationship between Daniel Andrews, the Labor Premier of Victoria, and the Prime Minister. And Gladys Berejiklian and Scott Morrison have worked closely together. And I'm quite certain that there's a lot of cooperation on the ground, but it's easier said than done to say, oh, I have a federal agency. Look, that means what? We're going to hand over police powers, rural fire service powers, the federal government? I think not. I think that the states quite understandably are going to say, well, part of the federal deal is for us to continue to do these things, and we work very closely together. And my experience when I was Prime Minister was that when you had terrible bushfires and the like, or terrible floods, you worked very closely with your state colleagues. I can remember working very closely on different occasions with Peter Beattie, who was the Labor Premier of Queensland. We didn't have any trouble coordinating services, and I think that there is goodwill between the federal and state governments, whatever the politics are, and people have no patience for party politics at a time like this.
But hasn't there been a bit of tension between New South Wales and the feds on this one? You know, the sort of accusations that New South Wales didn't call in defence or help from Mr Morrison early enough, and that, you know, that there should have been a greater cooperation. The unnamed New South Wales ministers having a fling back at Mr Morrison, you know, is that, how do you feel about that sort of stoush?
Well, I know both Scott Morrison and Gladys Berejiklian very well, and I worked very closely with them last year in their respective elections, and while I don't talk to them every day, obviously, I'm in fairly regular contact, and my perception is that they work together very closely on all sorts of things. Now, inevitably in the flow of policy issues there may be differences, but I'm not aware of any fundamental differences between them in relation to the response to these bushfires insofar as they affect New South Wales. My perception very much is that they're two people who work together very closely, and there's great goodwill and mutual respect between the two of them.
Now, Mr Howard, when you were Prime Minister, you were famous for saying the things that unite us are greater than the things that divide us. But if there is something that divides us as a nation, it seems to me it's climate change. And indeed, even with these fires, whether it's climate change that's caused them or hazard reduction. And, you know, a really different view on this with Queensland and the importance of jobs and coal versus, say, Victoria. How does a Prime Minister unite the country on this issue?
Well, the Prime Minister of the day will bring his or her own style, and uniting the country, as I spoke of it years ago, was uniting behind common values and common attitudes. And the common values that are important at a time like this are the values of helping your neighbour, helping your friends, as well as helping your family, and recognising that the great volunteer spirit of the Australian community comes to the fore. And what I'm sure shines through to everybody at the moment is that volunteer spirit is alive and well. And as for the ongoing policy debate about climate change, well, there are a range of opinions. I'm not in politics now, and I'll leave it to those who are in politics, but provided arguments are put with honesty and intellectual rigour, then it is within the capacity of our political system to reach the right decisions. And in the end, of course, all of those decisions are remitted to the Australian people. And we had an election less than a year ago, a federal election, and the Australian people were confronted with a whole range of issues, and they made a decision. And for the next 3 years, that decision will be implemented by the elected government. And if there's an alternative, then the opposition and others are invited to put that alternative and to argue the case. And if the Australian people accept it, then I think that we'll perhaps take a different approach. Whether they do, I'm not sure they will, but that is a matter for them. But we've had debates in the past about what is the right approach on something, and we'll have them in the future, but the arguments have got to be put and the debate has got to be conducted in a civilised fashion.
Do you think the impact of climate change on these fires could be overstated?
Look, I think the proximate cause of the intense fires is obviously the prolonged drought combined with the fuel loads in various parts of the country. The drought has been very long and it's been very severe. Now, the debate is the contribution that climate change has made to that. Now, I think we have to have a very sensible debate. I think the sort of approach that the federal government is taking on this issue at the present time is the right approach. We've made certain international commitments. We're bound, having made those commitments, we are bound to keep to them and implement them, but we're also bound to be concerned about our economy, to understand the value of export industries like coal and iron ore, to the future welfare and economic well-being of the Australian people, and you've got to get a balance. The Australian people want balance. They don't want extremes. They don't want fanaticism. They want a sensible working out of the problem and dealing with the challenges, recognising that giving people jobs and giving people hope and giving people a future is fundamentally important to our well-being.
When you were Prime Minister, I guess Bob Carr created a lot of national parks. He created a lot of wilderness areas, and you spoke about fuel load. Is it that sort of thing you're talking about when you talk about the fuel load?
When I'm talking about fuel load, I mean you can have national parks. And I think we all think national parks are a good thing, but we've got to make certain, in the context of that, that fuel loads aren't allowed to build too much. Now, I don't know whether they have been or they haven't been. I'm not across the detail of that, and I'm not making any accusations. I'm simply saying that as an ordinary citizen, it seems to me that the combination of this prolonged, very severe drought and the fuel loads have been the proximate cause of how intense and widespread these fires have been.
Now, you grappled with climate change, obviously, when you were in office, and, you know, even in 2007 you proposed an ETS, I guess. I mean, I guess, how much has it surprised you over the years that there's been so much toing and froing on this? The ETS, then no ETS, a carbon tax, then that was thrown out, and about how difficult it's been to kind of tackle this issue. Why do you think that's been?
No, I accept that it's been a very tortuous debate on occasions, but nothing entirely surprises me in the context of something like that.
Now, you have been giving Scott Morrison some advice, including, I think, yesterday morning. What sort of advice have you been giving him? I mean...
No,
Go on.
Look, I don't presume to give him advice. One of the things former Prime Ministers should really try and do most of the time is be like Victorian-era children, seen and not heard. And if my advice is asked, well, I give it, but I think Scott Morrison is doing a fantastic job as Prime Minister. I think he has a good connection with the Australian people, and he's somebody who will confront challenges, but I certainly don't go out of my way to give him advice. I give it if it's asked for, and any advice I give him, of course, is between him and me. And it's up to him whether that advice is made public or not. I don't intend to do so.
I guess the bumps he's had the first few days, you know, takes you back to your first term in government where you had a few bumps along the way. Can you relate to that time? And
Look, there's no Prime Minister that's been born who hasn't had a few bumps and won't continue to have bumps right through the time that he or she is Prime Minister. There's nothing unusual about that. Bumps come all the time. The important thing is how you handle them, and I'm impressed with the way in which Scott Morrison has taken off his coat and has really got stuck into dealing with this huge national challenge. And that is what people want. They don't want politics, they don't want point scoring, they want Liberal and Labor premiers and Prime Ministers working together for the national interest, because people have died, people have lost their homes, people have been terrified. We've got exhausted firefighters. They're the people we should be thinking about.
So there you have it, Tom, a very vigorous defence of Scott Morrison. Mr Howard was saying that he's not robotic, he has empathy and that he has a good connection with the Australian people, and saying on climate change that Australians want balance on the issue. And I think it really, he spoke about advice to Gladys Berejiklian and Scott Morrison. Says something, doesn't it, that an 80-year-old former Prime Minister is held in such esteem by those figures that they still need to go to him for advice. Might also speak to a few shortcomings along the way, of course.